All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. It looks like people have had a chance to get logged in, so we'll go ahead and get started here. My name is Kate Schwanhauser, and I am the Special Events Manager here at Food and Water Watch, and I'm so glad that you are all here for our event tonight on using social media as a tool for activism. We have a great training to share with you, followed by an exercise so you can try your hand at what we're going to discuss tonight. So I encourage everyone to participate in that. Before we dive in, just a quick Zoom orientation. We will be actively using the chat today to get your thoughts and ideas on the topics that we're discussing. So I encourage everyone to make sure you know where that is. And if you want, take a moment to say hi now and share where you're joining us from in the chat. We will also have time for Q&A with our Food and Water Watch social media experts who are here with us tonight. So please use the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you'd like them to answer at the end. And finally, we will be recording this event, and so we'll share that out later with everybody who RSVP'd. As many of you know, this event is part of our monthly member event series that we launched earlier this year in May. Many of you here tonight either give to us monthly or make an annual donation to Food and Water Watch, and we are so grateful for your generous support. It's what makes our work possible. Your support allows our organizers to work in communities across the country and at the national level to fight for bans against factory farms, to keep our water clean and affordable, and to fight against the fossil fuel industry to protect our climate. So thank you all so much. And this event series is just one way for us to thank you for your support as a Food and Water Watch member. We just released our winter event lineup, and you may have seen some of those events and signed up for them when you RSVP for this event tonight. But if not, I encourage you to join us for some of our upcoming events. So next month, we're hosting a film screening to share 3 short films by youth filmmakers on topics including environmental justice, protecting bee populations, and food security. And then in December, we'll be digging into a soon-to-be released research piece that's documenting the impacts of power plants on nearby communities, told from the perspective of some of those community members. And then we'll start the new year in January with our member event discussing climate anxiety, which is something I'm sure that we've all felt at some point or another, and strategies for not letting it overwhelm us so that we can all keep up this important fight. You can follow the link that we'll put in the chat if you want to RSVP for any of these events, and you can also see it on the screen here. So before we get started with tonight's topic, we're talking about social media and how it can be a powerful tool for activism. I want to launch a quick Zoom poll just so we can see what social media platforms everybody here is using. So let me go ahead and get that live. There we go. So I've just launched that poll and you should see that show up on your screen. I'll leave it up for a bit for the first part of this webinar and we'll come back to it a little bit later. So take some time and submit your answers, and then after our training, we'll review the results of everybody here today. So this training that we're about to share was originally held at our virtual conference last month with an incredible guest speaker, Jessica Klechka, who is a youth climate justice activist who's based in the UK. So with the time difference, she couldn't be here with us live tonight, but we are going to share a recording of that training now. And then afterward, we'll have a live conversation with Ari, who's our social media manager, and Yonit, who's our social media coordinator, to tell you a little bit more about how social media can be used to engage and inspire people to action. And then they'll lead you through that short exercise. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and play that training. And while I cue that up, again, the poll is live, and I'll leave that live through the training. So you can just take some time to fill that out as you're watching and listening to the tips that Jessica's about to share. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get that started.
Thank you so much for joining us today for an exciting session on using social media as a tool for activism. My name is Ari, Thank you so much for joining us today for an exciting session on using social media as a tool for activism. My name is Ari, and I'm our social media manager at Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Action. I'm responsible for overseeing our national social media strategy and providing support to our organizers and staff who are managing our regional social media presence. The goal of this session today is to help all of you learn how to effectively explain big, complex environmental issues in an accessible and engaging way, and how to increase your engagement on social media. Before we get started, I'd also like to introduce my colleague and our Food and Water Watch and Action social media coordinator, Yonit Friedman, who writes our daily social media posts for our national Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Since many of us are probably working in, volunteering, or connected to environmental issues, our conversation today will be focused around finding creative and engaging ways to present these sometimes nuanced and interconnected topics. It sometimes can be difficult to communicate effectively without sounding too wonky, but hopefully these tips today will help.
We are also thrilled to be joined today by Jessica Kletchka, a climate justice activist. With a background in psychology and environmental justice, Jessica is an expert at explaining and using social media as a platform to inspire others to take action on critical environmental issues. Jessica will be sharing some tips with us on how to effectively talk about climate change on social media in a way that will draw in your audience. This is a skill that's equally important to an individual posting on their personal accounts to raise awareness among your friends, your family members, or your colleagues, as it is here for those of us today who manage a nonprofit or organizational social media account. So now, without further ado, let's turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica, and I'm a climate justice activist, climate change educator, and writer. I'm from Poland originally, and I'm now based in Wales in the UK. Just a little bit about my work. I got involved in climate activism during my psychology degree in London, and I initially started researching which personality traits lead to pro-environmental behavior. And I then realized that it's not so much about who we are, but the messaging we're exposed to and the kind of environments we find ourselves in. So I decided that I didn't want to work as a psychologist, and I pursued a master's degree in climate change impact and adaptation, where I focused on climate change communication and the role of values in pro-environmental behavior and systems change. The interesting thing about values is that they're fluid, and they can change depending on who we spend time with, where we work or study, or even depending on the media we consume. How we communicate climate change is of crucial importance if we want to shift people's values towards those which favor environmental protection, degrowth, and a shift away from capitalism. I've also been involved with a range of environmental organizations against new fossil fuel development and raising awareness of environmental racism, indigenous land rights, and a variety of other causes. At the end of this month, I'll start working for Green Alliance, which is the leading environmental think tank in the UK, to bridge the gap between science and government action. Next slide, please. So climate change communication is extremely important because we still see very high rates of climate denial. A recent survey in the UK showed that only 38% of people believe that climate change is primarily caused by human activity, and that figure is similar in the United States. Climate denial has a long history, especially in the US, and since the early days of climate change science in the 1960s, the fossil fuel industry has paid scientists to produce studies which play down or deny the effects or even the reality of climate change. This is still happening today, with the most prominent example being the Heartland Institute, but nowadays, luckily, it's happening on a much smaller scale. Climate denial is most often fueled by misinformation in the media, and many news channels give a disproportionate amount of airtime to denialist views as opposed to legit scientists, although denialist views represent less than 1% of scientific opinion. The recent IPCC report has stated that climate change is unequivocally caused by human activity, which is a very strong statement. So usually we have a slight error margin in science, but we're pretty sure about this. Climate change now has many different facets today, and it does not necessarily mean an outright denial that climate change is real. Only 1% of people in the UK believe that the climate is not changing, and only about 5% of people in the US. This number used to be a lot higher, but we can thank the rigorous research of the IPCC report and the work of climate activists and public figures such as Al Gore in the US for rapidly changing public opinion in recent decades. However, climate denial manifests in more insidious ways these days, and these three are the most common ones. Firstly, greenwashing. Greenwashing basically means that companies pretend to be more environmentally friendly than they actually are. For example, if you look at Shell or Exxon's Instagram, for example, pretty much everything they talk about is how much carbon they're sucking out of the atmosphere, how many sustainable initiatives they're part of, and it's a really warped picture which doesn't really take into account the harm they're causing to ecosystems and communities. Secondly, wakewashing is a more recent strategy in which the fossil fuel industry capitalized on the rise of environmental justice movements. A lot of the people featured in fossil fuel ads and their social media accounts are people of color, which completely disregards the fact that those communities are most affected by environmental racism and land degradation perpetrated by those industries. Lastly, climate delay is often employed by industries and corporations to make the climate crisis seem less urgent than it actually is. This strategy often happens in tandem between industries and government, which ultimately means that governments don't follow up on their climate action goals. To illustrate that, the UK government has one of the most ambitious emission reduction targets in the world. I believe it's 78% by 2030. But our actual policies reduce CO2 emissions at only a quarter of the rate that they should. And as it stands, the UK investments in the green recovery per capita is only a very small fraction of that of the United States, which would have been unthinkable just a year ago. And it really shows that radical changes in policy are possible on a fairly short timescale. Next slide, please. It's important to note that misinformation is not the only factor contributing to climate denial. And that's when we need to talk about climate doomism. I do a lot of climate communication work on social media, and how we frame our messages is super important if we want to ensure that people act upon them. The reason I introduced this talk speaking about climate denial, apart from the fact that it's important to recognize and understand it, is that climate doomism is in fact a type of climate denial. And many media outlets and corporations engage in doomism to discourage people from acting on the climate crisis. Next slide, please. After the recent IPCC report, we saw a lot of climate doomism in the media, as these headlines demonstrate. This is a post I made on Instagram a few weeks back, and I just want to invite you to have a brief look for a moment and register how they make you feel. Now we're going to compare these to some more nuanced headlines. That's great, thank you. As a climate activist, it can be very tempting to sound the alarm bell, and we have a lot of reasons to do so. However, from a psychological perspective, this can often be counterproductive. Climate change is an existential threat, but from an evolutionary perspective, we've evolved to react to threats in three specific typical ways. Next slide, please. And those reactions are categorized as fight, flight, and freeze reactions. When we engage in climate doomism, our audience is very likely to react in one of these three ways, or a combination of them, depending on their personal history, their current environmental factors, and even genetic factors. Here we can see some examples. For instance, a lot of people still engage in the flight response. This can be climate denial, but it can also be avoidance of the topic or distraction. This could look like extreme materialism, climbing the corporate ladder, or claiming that you're too busy to engage with climate change. And this is the response most of us will be familiar with. Other people may fight and dedicate themselves to activism to the point of burnout. Those people might themselves engage in doomist messaging, and they can be labeled aggressive, alarmist, and judgmental by other people. Also, putting long hours into activism is not sustainable. I've been there myself. I've suffered from burnout, and it's really not contributing to the cause at all. Very often, people experience the freeze response, which often comes with detrimental effects on their mental health. People may be overwhelmed and unable to act. And in this state, we can experience conditions such as eco-anxiety, which many of you might be familiar with, depression, grief, and despair. Again, they're all not very conducive to action. Next slide, please. So how are we supposed to communicate climate change on social media? It can be a tricky one, but from a psychological point of view, these three factors are the most important ones. Firstly, focus on possibilities rather than threats. Activism works, and whenever a success happens, it's really important to celebrate it. For example, in early 2020, I joined Extinction Rebellion in blocking a coal mine in England. And as a result, plans for an expansion of the coal mine were dropped. This is only one example of many I've personally witnessed, and I think it's really important to be vocal about those victories in order to inspire other people. Secondly, this is a bit cliche, but be hopeful. People are a lot more inspired by hope rather than fear. And while it's important to stress the threat that climate change poses, our focus should be on what we can do about it. And lastly, hold the media accountable. Humans have evolved to pay more attention to negative messaging as a survival instinct, and the media really relentlessly exploit this fact. There's a lot of power in complaining to the media as a member of the public for the ways in which they frame and relay the climate crisis. And if you work in media, you can also use this knowledge to push for change within the industry. Next slide, please. Lastly, when we talk about communicating climate change on social media, it's really important to make it accessible. For those of us who work in the environmental sector or engage in activism, it can be really easy to forget that most people don't understand climate change very well. And this is why I want to conclude this talk with a few simple rules or tips for using social media as a tool to spread the climate message. Firstly, make it relevant. We probably all know the saying, think global, act local, but actually from a psychological perspective, this is not necessarily true when it comes to climate action. People are a lot more likely to start caring about global climate change when they see its effects on a local scale. And therefore, it's very important to get people involved in their local communities. For example, this can look like maintaining the local park or protecting a local endangered species. And this can then often spill over and develop into more wide-reaching action and activism. Secondly, be concise. We're constantly bombarded with information from many different sources, and our capacity to absorb new information is very limited. As a starting point, it's important to explain climate science in simple terms and then link to resources explaining it more in depth. Thirdly, avoid confusing terminology. Accessible language is everything when we want to include more people in the climate movement. For example, instead of carbon sequestration, you can say sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, or just make sure you define this term first before you use it in any context. I found climatejargon.ie a really great resource, and they basically explain common climate terms in plain English, and I've linked them here on this slide. Next, make your communication action-oriented. Start on a small scale with accessible actions, for example, changing your bank or who you vote for. For people who are more open and able to change their lifestyle, you can suggest more challenging actions such as changing one's diet or driving less. For those who are open to contributing both time and effort, you can suggest joining a local campaign group or starting their own campaign group. Lastly, and most importantly, we have to listen to our audience and other people. Find out what people's barriers are in engaging with climate change and shape your communication around them. For example, I did that with question stickers on my Instagram stories, and I just asked people, what do you perceive as the biggest barriers? It's important to remember that every single one of us is an influencer. It doesn't matter whether you have thousands of followers, whether you're a school teacher, for example, or whether you just talk about climate change at family gatherings. People have always been influenced by other people's opinions and knowledge, and all of us have our own spheres of influence. So it's all about learning what your spheres are and how to use them. That's pretty much all from me. I want to end by recommending some great climate communicators, which you could learn a lot from. I've certainly learned a lot from them. Next slide, please. Our Changing Climate on YouTube is a really great channel, very accessible and well-researched, and it's about all things climate, so definitely check them out. Next slide, please. Some really good accounts on Instagram you should follow. Intersectional environmentalists talk a lot about the intersections of climate and social justice, and I personally learned a lot from them. Curious Earth is an environmental news magazine, which I write for as well, and they often visualize environmental news on their Instagram. Queer Brown Vegan, also a very accessible environmental educator I've learned a lot from. Next slide, please. Earthrise Studio, a very interesting multimedia platform. Bad Activist Collective, a great resource for activists who want to move away from perfectionism and make their activism more real and more sustainable. And also, if you want to learn more about climate psychology, eco-psychology, connection with nature, and climate change communication, you can also follow me on Instagram at Jessica Kletchka. Next slide, please. Personally, my favorite podcast is the Yak's podcast. Michaela and Joe are really great activists and human beings, and they present intersectional environmental issues in a very accessible way. Very good for those new to the environmental movement, and also those not so new to the environmental movement. I want to end with some book recommendations. Firstly, Merchants of Doubt is all about how the fossil fuel industry paid scientists to come up with climate denialist research, which I talked about earlier. The second book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, is an amazing resource all about the psychological reasons for climate denial, which really helped me with my personal research. How to Save Our Planet is a collection of climate action points, from very easy and accessible ones all the way to more time-consuming and wide-reaching actions. And lastly, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety is a really good resource for activists who want to learn how to make their activism more sustainable and look after their mental health while doing so. That's it from me. Thank you so much for listening, and I really hope that my contribution will be helpful in shaping your climate change communication on social media. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was amazing. And we have lots of great comments and questions in the chat. I just want to close us out by saying that using digital channels and engaging copy and creative can really help you organize and win the fights that you're passionate about. Jessica has shared some great strategies and examples of how everyone can do this on their own social media pages. And we hope that this session leaves you empowered to do so. Some of you may volunteer or work for an environmental organization, but if you don't, this is something that you can do on your own personal pages too. Social media is definitely a powerful tool to drive awareness and action, and we hope that you're leaving this session today with sharper tools for your digital organizing toolbox. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of our 2021 virtual conference and benefit. Thank you.
All right. I hope everyone enjoyed hearing from Jessica. She is truly an incredible activist and very talented at using social media to raise awareness about climate change. And I think her perspective on the psychological background of how we respond to different types of messaging and how we can keep that in mind to be more effective in our own social media activism is really interesting as well. So if you're interested in following her on Instagram, we'll put her handle in the chat so that you can find her. And I know that she also shared a lot of resources at the end there, and all of them are really great. So we are going to compile those and share those out with all of you in a resource document in a follow-up email so that you can have those easily at your fingertips. So before we turn to our next section, I want to share the poll results. Everybody submitted their responses about what types of social media platforms you're all using. And we've got a great mix. So it looks like 78% of people here today are on Facebook. 44% also use Instagram, 56% are on Twitter, and 11% are on TikTok, which is great to see as that's a newer platform as well. So a good mix and really exciting. And thank you all for submitting those responses there. So I am going to turn to our next section where we're going to have a chat with Ari and Yonit. And Ari, as I mentioned before, and as she introduced herself in the training, is our social media manager here at Food and Water Watch. And so we'll talk a little bit about how social media is an important tool for the campaigns that we work on. So thank you, Ari, for being here tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So the first question I want to ask you, Ari, is just, can you tell us a little more about Food and Water Watch and what style or persona we try to use on our social media accounts?
Yeah, definitely. So Food and Water Watch's social media voice is what we like to call outraged academic. So that means that we're bringing an emotional appeal to very nuanced and interconnected topics. So that way people can understand and connect to them. And the style that we kind of do that through is by using engaging moments and showing those to actually drive people to action. And another way we do that is by sharing those moments on our social media.
Absolutely, yeah. And can you also tell us what are some of the campaigns or priorities that we're currently working on?
Yeah, so our main focus has been making sure that everyone has clean water, safe food, and a just and livable future. And we do that by organizing at the national, state, and local level. So some of our pillar campaigns right now that we've been working on is we've been pushing the Biden administration to ban fracking on federal lands and eventually at a national level, pushing for a moratorium on factory farms by advocating for the Farm System Reform Act, and pushing for massive improvements to our water infrastructure by urging Congress to pass the Water Act. So we have a national organizing team, and our regional organizers also do a lot of our local and state level organizing work by partnering with and supporting grassroots organizations in their area.
Yeah, it definitely takes all of us and all of those groups speaking up to make a difference on these issues, which, is why social media can be so powerful. So what role does social media play in our campaigns, for example, to end fracking? And how do you use it to simultaneously communicate with both the public and with elected officials?
Yeah, great questions. So like I mentioned, we have a national and a regional social media program. So we have Facebook and Twitter pages for our C3 and C4 national organizations, and then an Instagram page for Food and Water Watch, which is our C3. We also have a national TikTok. And in addition to those pages, we have regional Facebook and Twitter pages that are managed by our regional organizers who are all over the country. So we generally will use our C3 national pages for more general content and our C4 national pages for direct or grassroots lobbying. And how we're defining lobbying in this case is when we're advocating for a specific policy position or a piece of legislation, as well as targeting a specific candidate. But there's definitely some gray area around things like tweeting at an elected official's government versus campaign account. So we are generally really careful on the see-through during election years, and we won't tag a campaign account during those times just because we have to be super careful. Our philosophy on our social media is kind of a two-pronged approach. And so we see social media as an important piece of helping us win our pillar campaigns. We first educate our audience about important issues like why we need to ban fracking in a way that's easily understandable, but still doesn't completely water down our message. All of you are already well educated on the issues. And so sharing educational content is something that you can do on your own pages to help further educate a broader constituency. So after getting folks educated and fired up about the issues, in our case, food, water, and climate. The second piece of our approach is that we're hoping to bring people down the funnel from someone who likes or retweets a post to someone who will sign a petition, show up at a protest, or maybe even donate to our organization. So in terms of the actual content that we'll post to get people there, one of the things we make sure to do is capture and share content from real world events. So by showing people that we're actually out there on the ground and trying to inspire meaningful change, this can help inspire them to become part of the movement themselves. We're also not afraid to digitally bird dog members of Congress, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. So we're using our social media channels not only to communicate with the public, but to communicate with elected officials. So I want to show an example from a recent action that we did in New Jersey. So you can see a screenshot of part of the post there. So in this post, we used photos from a peaceful demonstration that we did with local allies to show our team in action. We showed up at an event in New Jersey with Energy Secretary Granholm and Rep. Frank Belloni. And some of our volunteers actually physically blocked cars in their motorcade. And that's a really powerful visual, right? So in this post, there's literally visual evidence of the fact that we're willing to take risks and block business as usual. So our audience is learning not just what we're fighting for, but how we fight for it. Our strategy is to share a lot of photos like this on our social media channels. So we're really telling the story of our activism. And I also want to note too that this post is on our C3 page because even though we were directly lobbying elected officials at the event itself, the photos and the post copy themselves are pretty vague in terms of policy or legislation that would be needed to meet our demands to ban fracking. So this post kind of walks the line between C3 and C4 compliance. And obviously, you know, if in-person demonstrations or events are something that your organization is doing right now, or if you're just an individual who's attending demonstrations, this should be pretty straightforward for you to recreate on your own social media. Just make sure to take lots of photos and videos at these events and then share them on social media with captions that tell the story of what you were doing and why. You can then follow this up with later posts about how to take action or content about how to take action. Another example that I want to show on the next slide, and there's a few different tweets. So I think we can just kind of tweet through them as I'm talking about these. But another example is from a recent campaign we did on Food and Water Watch's Twitter, where we digitally bird dogged members of Congress and asked them to sign on to a letter calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies. And so when I say digital bird dogging, what that basically means is that we're going to tweet at them relentlessly with our messaging. So for this campaign, we created a list of about a dozen members in Congress that were members of important committees that we wanted to target. And our goal was to get them to sign on to a letter voicing their objection to fossil fuel subsidies. We chose to do this on our C3 account since it is in kind of a gray area because we're talking directly to elected officials and we're not asking them to endorse specific legislation, but rather sign on to a letter. So we targeted their government Twitter handles for this, since all of the folks we targeted had both government and campaign accounts. And also because we generally try to only target campaign accounts if we're posting or tweeting on the C4. So this effort was pretty successful for us. And we ended up with 52 members of Congress total signing on to the letter against fossil fuel subsidies. And that was largely with the help of some annoying tweets. So the good thing about a campaign like this is it's relatively easy to execute. You would just need to come up with a list of targets, write some sample tweets with your demands, and then pick a specific time to tweet them out. You can do this over the course of a day or several. You just want to make sure that you're sending tweets pretty frequently, so it's creating kind of a flurry of notifications in your targets inbox. Another good idea is if you're going to do something like this is to come up with a short, simple, and unique hashtag for your campaign. If there's not one that already exists that you can use. One example of one that's already existing that we use a lot is hashtag ban fracking. And having a hashtag just makes it easy to see when any partners that you've partnered with share content. So that way you can retweet it or like it and just kind of generally lift the content up. But that's kind of the examples that I have and just sort of an overview of our social media persona at Food and Water Watch. I know Kate mentioned earlier that we would be doing an activity and showing some more examples. So I'd love to turn it over to Yonit to show us some more examples and for an exercise for everyone to try out.
Hi, everyone. So again, my name's Yonit. I'm the social media coordinator at Food and Water Watch. And what that means is that I write a lot of the content that goes out on our national social media channels. So a big part of my job is telling stories within the format of social media in such a way that educates people about our issues and moves them to take action. So I'm going to show some examples of content that took long fights or complicated issues and presented them in a way that was engaging for our audiences. So just a minute, let me share my screen. Moment, please. So if you didn't know about Food and Water Watch before seeing these images, what might they tell you? And no wrong answers here. You can just put whatever comes to mind in the chat box. Action takers, people love that. Community, yeah, I love that. Powerful, ooh, compliments, love it, thank you. Protest, block traffic, bilingual, yeah, it shows that we're not doing this work alone, it's in coalition, and that if you join us to do this work with us, you're not going to be doing this work alone. Protest, yeah, action takers, we're not standing back, not sitting back, I should say, we are actually getting things done. Wide umbrella of action takers, geographic location, yeah. So there's both practical information and also ideological information being shared. Anyone want to share one or two more things before I move on? Worth standing up for. I love that. Thank you. So let's talk language. What is our phrasing doing in this tweet? You can take a minute to read it. And then enter in the chat what you think this language and this phrasing is trying to do, what it's trying to communicate. One thing we intended was with the word again, we're almost rolling our eyes along with the viewers. Like, this is frustrating, and we can communicate frustration and almost making fun of how obnoxious and ridiculous this is. But then we get serious again, and we're clear about what we need, which are water safety regulations. And fun fact, we won on this recently. And we can also celebrate wins on social media. It's not just complaints. It's not just talking about what's wrong. In this tweet, we thank two politicians for sponsoring a piece of water justice legislation. And then succinctly within the character limit, we explain how this legislation supports our broader water justice goals. We talk about how this one smaller win is part of a bigger fight. So now we're going to be a little more interactive. We are going to try writing a post. I'm going to drop the link to this article in the chat. Take a few minutes to read it. In a nutshell, it's a Shell CEO, big fossil fuel CEO, showed up at a TED climate conference, as ridiculous as it sounds, right? And people responded, I would say, appropriately. People pushed back. People told him what he was doing wrong, why he shouldn't be there. So let's take like 5 minutes to read this. I'll give you some time for that. So you can think about what your post would say. Are there other organizations or people who you might tag? Don't worry about finding their official handles or usernames. You can just put in a placeholder name if you want. And then also, is there an action that you want people to take? It's not just about getting people angry. It's about, do you want them to read more? Do you want them to call their elected official? Do you want them to sign a petition? Or is it more just education? There's a time and place for all of it. Yeah, Bill, that's great. Protective shell. Love a pun. Let's say 3 more minutes, and don't worry, this is just, we're experimenting here. We're not actually going to put this up on our channels, so the stakes are very low. Just play with it. Love that, Ken. What I love about that is that it puts the audience who reads that in the position of the knowledgeable climate audience. You're showing them like they're smarter than this Shell CEO. One more minute. All right, and just for fun, this is what we wrote. And feel free to drop in the chat what you notice about this post, what it seems to be communicating. Ooh, love that, Haley. Bringing it both, bringing the national to the local scale and back.
All right. Well, thank you, Yonit. That was an excellent exercise. And thank you so much to everybody who put all of those incredible posts and ideas in the chat. It's so great to see all of the different things that everybody here is coming up with. And there's a lot of skill here tonight. So that's really exciting to see. We do have a little bit of time for Q&A now. So if there are any questions that you have for Ari and Yonit about social media strategies, please feel free to go ahead and drop those in the chat now. We did get a few submitted throughout the duration of the webinar, so we'll start with those. But if there are any others that come up, please go ahead and add those in now. So either Ari or Yonit, one of the first questions we got was, how do you decide which channel to post on? Do different platforms have different purposes?
Ari, I can take that. Or if you, okay. So the first thing to come to mind is that Twitter has a character limit. It is 240 characters maximum. So that really forces you to be concise. Whereas Facebook, you have more space, and certainly you can do Twitter threads if you want to tell a longer story. But Twitter lends itself well to being quick, to being snappy. Sometimes people use that to throw some humor in. There tend to be jokes that people respond well to on Twitter. Instagram is a visual platform, so we love to share photos from actions there. And Facebook is a little bit of both. You have more space, you have more room to talk, you have more room for a longer message, and you can share photos if you want.
Yeah, I think those are all super great points, and I would agree with all of that. The other thing I would add is just kind of when we are thinking about what channels we're posting on, we're also thinking about what type of audience we have on each channel. So our Facebook tends to skew toward women over 65. That is the audience that generally follows us on Facebook. So when we're thinking about the content that we share, we're thinking about what resonates with those folks that are on that channel. On Twitter, our audience tends to skew more toward men, and men who are kind of in that middle age range, that like kind of 40 or so age range. So when we're thinking about that content, we're thinking about what resonates with that channel. And then Instagram and TikTok are very much our younger folks, where they're kind of already engaged with those channels, so they follow us there. I see a question from Ken too about how do you grow your audience? You know, that's something that we're really always trying to do and always trying to get creative about. I think with social media, you're always sort of dealing with the challenge of what does well in the algorithm and trying to balance that with trying to get your message out, because if your content isn't doing well on your social media, you know, it doesn't get pushed up in the algorithm and then no one sees it, right? It's kind of like the tree falls in a forest thing. So we're always trying to do new things, whether that's different tactics on Twitter, joining on tweet storms on Twitter, trying new graphics and memes on Facebook and Instagram. We need to post more on TikTok, I will admit. So we're really just kind of always trying to do new things to reach new people, and thinking about audience when we're doing those things.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And I see another one in the chat about, will there be a more concerted effort to identify key legislators who should be outed for being climate deniers or fossil fuel advocates? Or to your point earlier, Ari, will that get toned down as the elections get closer next year?
Yeah, so it's tricky with elections, right? There's kind of some interesting rules around C3, C4 compliance where we have to be careful around election years, but there is sometimes kind of a loophole because the C3, C4 compliance rules basically say that if you are doing an activity that you have been doing already, so let's say, for example, that we've been tweeting at Senator Schumer to end fossil fuel subsidies, if we've been doing that consistently and on a regular basis, we still are able to do that on our C3 account. Because we've been kind of putting in that time and making that regular effort. You know, there are some sort of technical things that have to happen where we log time and track that time as lobbying time. But if we've been doing the work already, we generally won't tone it down too much. If it's a target that we haven't been speaking about a lot already, or we really haven't just gone after in a really concerted, effort, we generally will avoid targeting those folks on our C3 channels and C4 channels as elections get closer, just because we don't want to break any of those compliance rules where it looks like we're endorsing a candidate when we haven't been doing that work beforehand.
Yeah, thank you.
So, yes.
And I will also just share, this is not necessarily social media related, but Food and Water Watch does have a Biden Climate Watch project that is a web piece. And we can drop the link in the chat for that in a second. But basically, it's very similar to what you just asked about, Bill, where we're keeping track of all of the promises that Biden has made related to fossil fuels and trying to hold him accountable to those promises that he's made. So we'll make sure that we share the link to that too. I see one other question that's come in through the Q&A. So this person does a lot of posting to their personal accounts. They don't work for an organization, but as a non-graphic designer, how can they create their own images for social media?
That is a great question. So there are actually some really great free tools out there to create graphics for social media. One that hopefully some of you have heard about, but if not, I would love to talk about it, is Canva. So Canva is a super easy to use and free tool that allows you to create images that you can post on your social media channels. So, in the past, people had to have access to fancy editing software like Adobe Creative Suite, but that's really not the case anymore, and anyone can try their hand at design. So the great thing about Canva is you can kind of build things from scratch if you already have some design experience. Sorry, my puppy is barking. If you already have some design experience, you can build your own things, or they also have templates that you can work off of. So those can be super helpful if you're looking for content for your social media channels. And yes, Tamara, I love Canva too. Like, I could talk about Canva all day. So
likewise, it's a great tool.
Just saw one new question come in. How do you prevent from overwhelming audiences?
I can answer that. In terms of overwhelming with content, with the headiness of what we are talking about, one way that we try and do that is by offering ways to take action. It's not just bombarding people with how devastating the climate crisis is, though it is devastating, but offering things that people can do about that, even if it's just signing a petition. That's a big one. That's a big priority for us.
yeah, I think totally agree with that. And I think I saw a question earlier too that sort of plays into this one, which was, how do we kind of balance content that's negative that we know sort of does better in the Facebook algorithm with content that's positive, sort of like what Jessica talked about in her session. And I think the answer to that is there really is a balance. Like Yonit mentioned, we do have to provide calls to action and ways for people to be inspired, because if we're down in the dumps all the time, unfortunately, I think people will just feel overwhelmed and anxious. So we really do kind of have to hit a balance of inspiring hope and getting people to take action, but then also playing into the Facebook algorithm. Because like I mentioned before, Facebook, if it favors your content, it will show up in folks' feeds, and then they'll be more likely to see your content that comes after that post. If you don't follow that algorithm, people don't see your content. So we're really trying to play that balance to make sure that folks are seeing our content, but we're still getting a mix of messages that are both positive and more critical. And like Yonit mentioned, adding an action or ways that people can get involved, so that we're not just creating all this emotion, but actually giving people a place to put it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are coming up on time here, so I think unfortunately that will have to be the end of our Q&A. But thank you, Ari and Yonit. I definitely learned some useful tips from you both tonight, and I hope that everyone else here did too. And again, I really loved seeing everyone's responses in the chat. There were just so many creative ideas for posts and for getting people engaged. some clever puns too. So it's just really great to know that you're all using your own platforms and your own voices to talk about these important issues because, as Jessica shared earlier, we all have our own spheres of influence. So we're just so grateful to you all for using your own platforms to raise awareness about these issues. So thank you all for everything that you're doing to support this movement. And just again, as I mentioned earlier at the start, this training that we shared was part of one of the 12 sessions from our virtual conference last month. And there were many more just like it, covering topics like environmental justice, voting rights, our factory reform campaign, and many trainings on effective storytelling and how to meet with elected officials, among lots of others. So for a small donation, if you were not able to attend the conference, all those recordings are still available online through the end of the year, along with now 4 special bonus content sessions. There's just tons of great resources there for anyone who's looking to learn more or develop a new skill. So we'll put a link in the chat for you to access those if you're interested. And then as well, that access includes our amazing keynote speech from Amy Goodman, who's the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, and a recording of our annual benefit, which had tons of special guest speakers, including Mark Ruffalo, which is very exciting. So again, if you're interested in access to all of that content, you can visit the link that was just shared in the chat. And finally, before we close out today, I encourage you all to take our post-event survey. We do really value your feedback and it helps shape this event series. And everyone who fills out the survey will be entered into a drawing to win a Food and Water Watch bandana. And you can see our very own New York organizer, Santosh, modeling one of these bandanas here in this picture. He actually just joined us in DC a few weeks ago for the People versus Fossil Fuels Week of Action that we held outside the White House, calling on President Biden to ban fracking and put an end to the fossil fuel era. So those bandanas are being put to good use. So again, the link to the survey is in the chat, and we'll also send that out over email afterward as well. And then I do invite you to join us for next month, our film screening, or for any of our upcoming member events. You can see that lineup here on the screen. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we did record this event, so I'll send that out along with the survey link, the RSVP link for these events, and all those great resources that Jessica shared in her training in a follow-up email in the next couple of days. So with that, I just want to thank you all so much for being here with us today, and I hope you all have a great evening. Goodbye, everyone.